Today's conversation is all about the geopolitics of tech and AI, the concept of technological resistance, and how we can protect our cognitive integrity in today's information ecosystem. I'm joined by a guest who's very difficult to introduce because he's done it all. He's curated and directed the TED conference. He's written for the New York Times. He's co-founded a software company, but he's also the author of several books, and we'll be discussing his most recent one called Our Minds Under Siege. It's a wonderful book. Bruno Giussani, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me on Matter of Fact.
My pleasure.
I want to start quite broadly. Arguably, since the Industrial Revolution, for every new technology that's come up, there have been people or groups of people calling for caution or even calling for resistance. And yet, since then, technology seems to have progressed quite unperturbed. So what, in your view, makes this time different?
Clearly, we are a species that co-evolves with technology. There is no doubt, since the very beginning of time, since the first tools made either to fight somebody else or to carry the harvest. We have co-evolved and over time accelerated our progress. So obviously technology is not the enemy. The way we develop it, though, and the political and social and economic context within which technology is developed do matter, and we cannot ignore them. When we raise some red flags about particularly artificial intelligence, there is very often a response that goes in the direction of, technological transformations have always happened, we have always lost jobs and then we have created other jobs in new professions, there has always been social upheaval and then it has been reabsorbed. There is a sort of consolation of history that we are trying to find. This transformation is really different from others for a few different reasons. The first is the nature of the technology. Artificial intelligence is the first technology in history that is starting to adopt and get characteristics of autonomy, capacity to learn about the world, to decide increasingly autonomously about the circumstances that it, quote unquote, encounters in that learning about the world, and having real impacts on the world. And doing all that through a language that we don't fully understand. No other technology in history has had this kind of characteristics. The developers of the technology themselves say that they're not sure what happens inside the black box that is, for example, a large language model or so. That's not the case of a crane, of a truck, of an industrial machine, of any other technology we have developed before. Second big point of differentiation is who controls the technology. During the Industrial Revolution, a machine would be invented and developed and implemented in a factory in Manchester, England, and then little by little it would make its way through Europe, and suddenly a similar machine doing the similar things would be installed in a factory in Germany or in Switzerland or in Italy. But the owner of that machine would not be the same, right? It would be somebody from Germany or Switzerland or Italy. The ownership and the control of the infrastructure of the Industrial Revolution was way more spread and distributed. It would be way more distributed than today, where technology disseminates around the world, but remains in the control of the same companies and the same people running and controlling those companies. Allow me to mention a third element that I think is important and has to do with the way we understand digital technology. Many of us still look at digital technology as a product. We have a smartphone in our hand and yeah, it's a product. And so we bought it, it's ours, we control it, we do what we want with it. The nature of technology has changed. What used to be a product now is a platform. You used to buy Microsoft Excel or Microsoft Word and install them on your computer, and they were yours, and you would do whatever you wanted with them. And you didn't have any relationship with Microsoft at all afterwards, unless you wanted to update the software, or there was a bug and they would send you a patch for fixing the bug. Now you need to subscribe to them. And when you subscribe to them, you get an account, you get a password. Even if it's free, it's still a subscription. You still need to get an account and a password to access them. You use them no longer on your machine, but use them on the cloud. And the cloud is somebody else's computer, controlled by somebody else. So we are now in a situation where a lot of our key processes, economic, political, social, collective, go through computers, somebody else's computers, controlled by somebody else. That gives them an immense power to define and decide what we can do, what we cannot do, which is the nature of software. You enter into this logic of depending on a technology controlled by a very small number of organizations.
Let's talk about that aspect that you mentioned of control, and with it comes, of course, the fact that AI is increasingly becoming, or tech is increasingly becoming, a critical infrastructure that has geopolitical relevance, right? So the United States, of course, is currently at the forefront of all of these technologies, with China not far behind it. And the United States specifically has a relationship to Europe that is changing very much. It's currently turning increasingly hostile towards Europe. And of course, that makes any kind of dependency and technological dependency more critical to address. Do you think that the current US administration's self-interest, their ruthlessness, their view of the world, which is very transactional, is that a temporary blip in US history? Or do we need to assume that this is the perception of the world and the perception of their role in the world that the United States will have from here on out, that this is how they will act on the geopolitical stage going forward? And is it time, in other words, for Europe to stop viewing the United States as an ally once and for all?
Before answering the question directly, we need to qualify the kind of dependence that we're talking about. Over the last 20-25 years, Europe, and by Europe I don't mean the European Union, I mean European countries and European companies, has developed an incredibly dangerous dependence on American digital technology. 80% of the technologies we use collectively or individually, digital technologies, are of American origin. That's, of course, a staggering number, and that creates an element of dependency, and every dependence can be turned into coercion, into pressure, into submission. That's the kind of situation in which Europe has kind of allowed itself to go into. And the American administration knows it, right? The American administration, as this administration, the Trump administration, but it was kind of real already before, it was developing already before. It's not something that happened overnight because Donald Trump entered the White House. It's something that has developed over a couple of decades. But this administration is very, very clear on the role technology can play in their projection of power into the world. You may remember that very strange moment when Donald Trump was inaugurated in January 2025. And of course, he's surrounded by his family, but just behind him, you don't have the members of his cabinet, the members of his government. They are one row further. Just behind him, there are the leaders of the major tech companies in the United States, Amazon and Google and Apple and X and so on. And there's not just a rich person that wants to be surrounded by other rich persons. That's a signal, is a signal of the fact that technology is core to the way America plays its role into the world going forward, right? And that accounts for digital tech in general, and accounts even more for artificial intelligence. So your question about, is it a blip or is it something more profound? I think it's something more profound, but because it doesn't just relate to the arrival for the second time of Donald Trump in the White House. Of course, that's an accelerant of all this movement. And of course, the choices the Trump administration has made, not only him, but everybody around him as well, of shifting from alliance and friendships and multilateralism to really hostile kind of position, aggressive kind of position. But it inscribes itself in a broader global geopolitical realignment that has not been brought into the world by the Trump administration, but by much deeper tectonic transformations, one of which, of course, is the rise of China as an economic superpower, as a mineral and material superpower, and soon as a military and technological superpower. And so you enter into the situation where the decline in power, or the power that sees its power challenged, reacts to the challenge. So the United States, seeing their power challenged by China, reacts to that power in an incredibly defensive way that becomes aggressive towards the rest of the world. Hence, America first, and all the rest. Right? So there are big movements that are not directly tied to the Trump administration, which somehow becomes a sort of accelerant of that, and has clearly chosen that path, the confrontational path, with almost all the rest of the world. Now, a lot of the rest of the world, and particularly Europe, is answering to that aggressivity in a very submissive kind of way, mostly because of dependencies of various kinds. Think just of the way Europe depends on American military support for its security, for example, or other similar elements. And also because of the still massive importance of the American economy in the scope of the global economy and financial system. But that movement, the challenge that China represents to America, and all the realignment and redistribution of power relations around that is really the core of what's happening here.
So you don't think that Europe can assume a return of multilateralism or a return of the international rules-based order?
There are people around Europe that seem to think that, we just have to wait for Donald Trump to get out of the White House and things are going to go back to normal. And that's definitely not the case. So if we hope that some form of multilateralism and rule-based order and international governance based on international organizations of broad membership will be able to survive and potentially find a footing again and have a significant role, then we need to enter into a different kind of scenario. And the scenario is probably that would not be led, like in the last 70 years, by the United States. Even if we were able to go back to some forms of that, they would be different from what we had before, both in terms of what they are and how they function, and in terms of who would be leading and constructing them.
So in any case, it's in Europe's interest to reduce their dependence technologically on the United States and on other actors. And one of the proposals that you put forth in the book is an alternative European tech ecosystem that would be prioritized at least by public procurement, if not by private actors such as individuals and companies. We know from the climate debate that hoping that individual consumers will change their behavior for moral reasons is a very difficult thing to hope, right? And people, obviously, very naturally, they want things to be cheap, they want things to be convenient, they want things to work well, and those things are fulfilled by the products that American tech puts forward. So I understand the argument for prioritizing European products in public procurement. That's reasonably easy to implement, right? But how do we incentivize private individuals, private companies, where I doubt that a moral argument will work, to switch to the European tech ecosystem and the European alternatives that you write about?
Yeah, we have adopted this view of the world that what matters first is economics. What matters first is competitiveness. what matters first is efficiency. And therefore, the political or social or moral considerations come in second place, or even further down the scale. It's a very dangerous place to be. It's a very dangerous way of looking at the world, because, of course, you enter into a logic where the faster and the stronger and the ones who has less scruples in trying to leverage their position are gonna win, and you're gonna just keep having to make accommodations with this kind of situation. Now, the proposal I put in the book essentially says a couple of things. It says Europe is too dependent on American technology, digital technologies. And by the way, I focus in the book on digital tech. I think this is an important thing to say. Not because I think that that's the most important problem the world has, right? We have rising inequalities of many kinds. We have a climate crisis, a biodiversity crisis. We have wars starting in lots of places around the world. There is a looming water crisis coming. So I'm not saying that solving the digital tech problem is the most important challenge. I'm saying is the most urgent challenge. Why so? Because we're not going to be able to solve any of the other problems if we don't maintain at least a unified vision of reality. And that unified vision of reality, our capacity to understand the world lucidly and on a fact-based way, is being degraded, is being transformed, is being manipulated by the fact that we are getting our information through digital platforms, through digital instruments. And that's where information gets manipulated, voluntarily or involuntarily. Voluntarily by bad actors, involuntarily by the simple dynamics of algorithms whose job is to keep you glued to the screen and steal your attention and steal your data. And therefore, if we cannot fix that, it's going to be very difficult to fix anything else, because in many cases, we don't even have a common understanding of reality. And I'm not talking about disagreeing on opinions, which is totally fine, or even disagreeing on the interpretation of reality. But we are losing the capacity to actually agree, at least on the basic facts. And that's why I think is the most urgent element. Now, to go back to the question of dependency and so. So Europe is extremely dependent on US digital technologies. We can continue to do that and therefore become somehow a sort of colony, digital colony of the US, in the assumption that the point of pressure is going to be, well, we can degrade or limit or even withdraw access to the technologies if you don't do this and this and this and this. Maybe a way to explain to what point we are vulnerable is this. If tomorrow morning, car company Mercedes was to announce that they are going to leave with immediate effect the Swiss market, what's going to happen is that some owners of their cars will not find spare parts. Some garages that sell their cars may be bankrupt. But at a systemic level, at the level of the way the Swiss system works, nothing is going to happen. Switzerland is going to continue to work. If Danone, the French food company, will announce their withdrawal from Switzerland, some of us may lose access to their favorite yogurt. But at a systemic level, nothing is going to happen. But if Google is going to announce their withdrawal from Switzerland, or Amazon, or Microsoft, the country is going to stop, right? Companies are going to stop. They're not going to have access to their documents, their payment systems, their accounting, their processes, their industrial control systems. Public administrations, the same thing. That's the level of vulnerability that we have built into our systems. Now,
but can I just ask you there, do you think that example, do you think that argument is enough to push people?
No, that's exactly the problem, right? Because, exactly. You're right. Because, of course, this is a similar kind of argument as the climate change discussion, right? Is somehow a distant or unlikely, but not impossible thing, right? What is called the tail risk. So a risk that is tiny, but if it happens, it has outsized implications. And so I'm not sure it's sufficient to inject the kind of transformation, urgent transformation we would need, and therefore we need to jumpstart it somewhere. We cannot go to private companies and tell them, hey, you need to run your business on this tech rather than this tech, right? That's against so many principles of free markets and all the rest. But, and you mentioned public procurement, with public money we can do whatever we want collectively. We can decide that we're going to send it in this direction or in this direction. And right now we are sending a lot of public money from Europe to the United States, tens of billions, probably hundreds of billions of dollars a year, to rent American technology that we don't control, over whose development we have no say, that manages our data in ways that are definitely problematic because the United States have extraterritorial laws and all this kind of things. And by sending the money to American companies, we finance the research and development of the American companies, the further development of their technology, the investment they make in assets, then we have to rent in order to use, think of data centers, and so on. It's a completely absurd situation. And so we need to start redirecting some of that towards European technologies. I want to stress that I'm not talking about governments subsidizing companies. I'm talking about governments redirecting their demand for technology so that companies can develop the technologies to satisfy the demand, right? I'm talking about demand and offer. I'm talking about market mechanisms, not subsidies. And it doesn't mean unplugging or decoupling completely from American technology. It means evaluating clearly the levels of risks. Information that has to do with healthcare, for example, sanitary information, fiscal information, national security information, should not sit on an American cloud. It should sit on a Swiss cloud or a German cloud, right, for the Germans. While information that has to do with the summer school where you go and learn another language maybe can sit on a less secure kind of thing. And I'm not talking secure in terms of data protection, I'm talking secure in terms of geopolitical tensions. Those alternatives do exist for many things, not for everything, but for many things. But they're small, they're local, but unless we start buying them and allow them to grow, they're never going to become potential one-on-one competitors to the American companies, right? We are starting to see momentum on that because the discourse is really taking root. Just over the last several weeks, we have had the French government announcing that they are asking every ministry at the national level to prepare a plan. By the end of the year, they need to prepare a plan to significantly diminish what they call the extra-European technology dependencies. It's interesting they use extra-European, not extra-French, because it signals two things. First of all, that they're going to try to find solutions not only in France, but in Europe, which opens the doors, for example, for collaborations between European companies to develop better technologies or to scale up their services and so on. And of course, by saying extra-European dependencies, they mean the Americans, but they also mean potentially the Chinese, from which we are less dependent right now. But of course, what we don't want is shift from an American dependency to a Chinese dependency, right? And so the European Union has just put on the table, the European Commission, a big policy package called the Package for European Technology Sovereignty. The various cities and ministries and police forces and others in Europe have announced similar things. Even Airbus, which is possibly the most iconic kind of company, global company in Europe, number one maker of commercial airplanes in the world, has announced that they're looking for European cloud solutions. Airbus is an interesting example because Airbus is the number one competitor of Boeing, Boeing is a company that is completely symbiotic with the American government and the American army. The fact that the main competitor of Boeing has their data on the Google Cloud sounds like a beginning of a spy story, but it's actually reality. But Airbus is an interesting case because right now, as I said, we are starting to see momentum. We are starting to see a lot of awareness and a lot of at least attempts at figuring out how can we proceed. But at the same time, we need to keep the systems going. And so at the same time, we are still signing new contracts with American companies and deepening the dependence. Airbus just announced that they're looking for a European cloud solution. At the same time, they extended a contract with an American company for handling their data. So we're in a sort of schizophrenic kind of situation, right? It's typical of this kind of transitions where you want to change the system, but you need to keep the system that you have running. And so that balance is complicated. Public procurement is actually the small fraction of spend on digital technology. So then we need to find a way to get private money, so company money, into that as well, to fund the development of European technology and European assets. When you're a government, of course, you can look at things the way a business looks at things, which is essentially a cost-benefit kind of analysis. And we have been telling governments, you need to run more like businesses for the last 30 years at least, right? And personally, I completely dislike that framing because there is a reason why a government is not a business. And it is that there are things in society that need to be run not like a business. And therefore, governments need to start, and by governments I mean public administrations in general, they need to start looking at technological choices, not only in terms of cost benefit, it's going to cost me less and it's going to do this, but also taking into account considerations that have to do with particularly national security, digital sovereignty, and geopolitical situations. I give an example that is Swiss. So a few months ago, this small online magazine that does great work called Republik has revealed a document, has made a big investigation about Palantir, the American tech company, and their dealings in Switzerland. And they revealed a document from a working group of the Swiss Army, which was tasked with analyzing Palantir's offerings. And the document essentially is a review of Palantir's software, and they end up saying, well, it's a great software. It actually works. It does exactly what it says it does. But we do not recommend purchasing it because of national security considerations, because of the fact that this is an American company very close to the American government, whose CEO says things like American national security sits above everything else for us, including presumably their customers' interests. And so there is, and this is a quote, possible leakage of information towards the American government. That's exactly the case in which geopolitical consideration comes into play, even if the cost-benefit analysis would say, great, right? And then you have that element, and you need to start considering that element.
I want to bring in one more thought before we move on to like the whole information ecosystem and information integrity topic. You said that the moral argument to get people to switch to European tech is difficult to make, not least because we have become accustomed to thinking above all in terms of effectiveness, in terms of profits, efficiency, profitability. Yep. But the reason that those factors are so compelling to think about is that they are what secure our standard of living, right? Mm-hmm. How competitive we are, how economic we are, how well our economy performs, that ultimately is what secures our standard of living. Mm-hmm. And each and every single one of us feels that in a very real way in our day-to-day life. And that is part of what makes the American dream so compelling, is that if you work hard and you learn how to be efficient and you learn how to be competitive, then you will have a good life. And if we want to turn away from America, then maybe we need something European to turn towards. And if you look at recent election results in Europe and this rise of nationalist movements in Europe, it suggests that we don't really have that we don't really have this alternative notion of a European dream that would convince people. We don't have this compelling European narrative. Maybe we just haven't found a European narrative that convincingly puts something else other than profits and economic viability and competitiveness at the center, and that maybe that is why people are not buying into a more European-centric way of looking at things, including shifting away from American tech.
It's really interesting what you say, because on one side, this focus on optimization and productivity and economic advantage is very American. So we have kind of adopted that and put it as a sort of a mantle over our way of looking at the world. But the reality is, first of all, the American dream is completely broken, right? America is a powerful country in economic terms, a powerful country in military terms, but in terms of quality of life, it's for the most part definitely worse than in what we have in Europe as quality of life. We cannot only measure quality of life in terms of the paycheck you get at the end of the month. We need to reaccustom ourselves to the idea of the European dream, which we are never called that way, but somehow is embodied in many things and many choices we collectively have made in Europe over the last several decades. A choice of collaboration, a choice of freedom of movement without showing a passport at the border, or a choice of having a common currency for many countries around Europe, a choice of protecting our security together. Switzerland itself is part of the Schengen Agreement without being part of the European Union, and so on. A choice of peace rather than belligerence, a choice of being welcoming, at least until recent times, rather than being closed. A choice of being connected to the rest of the world. One of the big weaknesses of Europe today, in economic terms, is this idea that we are a globalized economy and therefore we are open to free competition, right? Including competition from outside of European countries. But at the same time, we are confronting competition from countries that have a completely different approach, that have heavy involvement of the government in the way the industry develops, and so on. I'm talking about China and the United States. The idea of industrial policy, so of governmental intervention in steering the general direction of where the economy should develop, in Switzerland and Europe is like a gigantic taboo. It's all about individual initiative and individual responsibility and these kind of things. But in China and the United States, it's core to what the governments do. We are exposing ourselves to the competition of people who don't play with the same kind of rules. But it's true that somehow these characteristics of Europe have become not valued in the same way as the rush for economic growth and for technological everything that we see from the United States they kind of look more fascinating than what we have. And I think we need to find a way to rebalance that. You're totally right. Now, I don't know how to frame that in terms of this is the European dream, but it seems to me to be just a human dream, right? The fact of living in peace rather than living in a belligerent kind of context doesn't need to be a European dream. It's a dream of everybody, in principle. The fact that we should all have, basic education and basic healthcare doesn't need to be a European dream. It's a general dream. So you're totally right. There is a question of reframing the narrative, but we have all the elements for the narrative, including, by the way, in technological terms. We have the money to invest, we have the technologies, we have the research universities, we have the talents. We need to figure out a way to turn that into a real economic European dynamics.
So maybe it's a sales problem. I want to move on to the question of information integrity that you raised, where you rightly said that if we can't agree on a shared reality, if we can't agree on shared facts, then we're going to have a very hard time solving any other issue, right? And so I'd like to talk to you a little bit about how you think that we individually can protect ourselves starting now and protect our cognitive integrity from this cognitive erosion that is likely to go hand in hand with the rise of Gen AI, and from the stupidogenic environment, to quote the book, that is likely to threaten our critical thinking and our cognitive abilities. One of my favorite quotes in the book was you write that when we interrogate a chatbot, what we think we're asking is, what is the answer to this question? But what the machine actually decodes is, what would an answer to this question look like? And you also describe these large language models as sophisticated simulators. What is something that you would like every single LLM user to really understand about the models that they're conversing with?
Yeah. Two or three quick things. The first one is chatbots are not neutral. They're not machines that have any level of objectivity, and they're not machines that have any level of understanding of the world. Go to an American chatbot, any American chatbot, and ask, which is the economic system that is the best to provide well-being for all? And then ask the same question to a Chinese chatbot, right? And the American one will extol the virtues of capitalism with as few rules as possible, and the Chinese one will go into a lecture about socialism with Chinese characteristics and potentially some Xi Jinping thought. And that tells you at what point the chatbots are actually machines that are programmed for saying a certain thing and not saying another thing, for reacting in a way and not in another. And part of it is just by the fact that they are trained on data sets that tend to say one thing rather than another, but part of it are actually explicit design choices and programming choices that are inserted into the code to make sure that the chatbot says one thing rather than another. So they are not neutral machines. We need to consider them that way. They're not search engines either. A lot of people now are turning to ChatGPT as they turned to Google before, or if they turn to Google, they are content with the small AI generated answer that comes on the top of the page. But that's a different thing than being a search engine. A search engine finds the sources for you and points you towards sources. A chatbot creates a summary and offers you the summary. But a summary is also something not neutral and not objective. The choice of one adjective versus another adjective can change the meaning of the kind of information. And even if it's all written beautifully and looks syntactically and orthographically perfect, that doesn't mean that it is true or that it is the best possible answer to a question, or not even the answer you should get about the question because it matches reality more than others. I give you an example to better understand the difference between a text that's fluid, beautiful, correct, etc., and a text that's actually fact-based, right? Imagine that in Zurich, where you are, an hour ago there was a robbery. A bank was robbed. And the last sentence of the short news report that appears on the local website says, and then the robbers drove away in the direction of the south in a red car. And that's a correct sentence, and it describes the facts, right? But you can also imagine that the sentence says, and then the robbers drove away in the direction of the north in a blue van. Orthographically and syntactically, in terms of fluidity, the sentence is exactly the same, but it doesn't reflect reality anymore, right? We should be very careful of trusting a text just because it's beautiful, or trusting a video just because it seems correct. You need to constantly question the products of AI. So that's the first thing. Not neutral, not objective, not a search.
Not a notion of truth either, right? Like, as you just have this sense of...
That is the second thing. It doesn't have a sense of the truth because it doesn't have a sense of the world, right? An LLM, a chatbot, is a machine that has learned how to imitate how a human would behave or express himself or herself in a given circumstance. And that's actually the original definition of artificial intelligence. Back in 1956, the first conference that had artificial intelligence in the name, the definition used back then was a machine can be considered intelligent if it does or says things in a way that, if done or said by a human, would be considered intelligent, right? So it's a question of imitation. It's a question of mimicking. You enter into a discussion with a chatbot and you go on for 3 hours at night and you exchange intimate thoughts, and then you say, okay, now I go to bed, and the machine says, I will miss you. And the machine has no way to miss you because it has no emotions, right? It has no embodied experience of the world. But the machine knows that that's what a human would probably say in that circumstance or something similar. And so it kind of expresses that. That's the way they work. Chatbots, LLMs, don't cry, don't laugh, don't solve anything. And we need to be constantly aware of that element as well.
I want to come back to this. You quote an education expert in your book. Her name is Daisy Christodoulou, and she draws this analogy with food that I think is very apt, right? She says that we are in danger of creating a stupidogenic environment, much like the obesogenic environment that we've created. She says we're creating an environment where we don't challenge our brain anymore, and that's causing it to atrophy and to break down. And so by now we know quite a bit about what makes a healthy physical diet, right? Mediterranean, lots of fruits and vegetables, not too processed, not too much sugar, whole grain, etc. What does a healthy cognitive diet look like? So what do I need to do to remain cognitively healthy in a stupidogenic environment?
Yeah, 2 or 3 things. One is fewer hours in front of a screen in general, right? Well, of course, we work in front of a computer, so but then we spend hours doing things that we consider entertainment, but the reality is that they interfere with our cognitive capacities. How many of us have, laid on a couch and started, looking something on Instagram or TikTok, and after 45 minutes we kind of wake up from these days, from this sort of hypnosis, and we realize that we don't even remember what we've seen in those 45 minutes, right? And most of it is completely irrelevant anyway. And so less time in front of a screen is definitely number one. Also remembering that the whole goal of the machinery that's behind the screens, of the economic and technological system behind the screens, is to keep us glued to the screens, to capture our attention. So we need to resist that actively. Second thing is long form versus short form. Right now we have thousands of studies and a long list of research about how our attention span are decreasing, our capacity to concentrate, our capacity to understand an argument or to develop an argument, to read a book to the end and to remember what we've actually read and understand what we actually read, to enter into complex abstract thinking, or plenty of things like that. Not to mention the physical disruptions, sleep disruptions and things like that, that are somehow caused by the fact that our attention is constantly fractured by everything that is short form and repeated. The constant notifications, the fact that we switch from one platform to the other, one screen to the other constantly just to go and see what happens there. So long form, I don't mean that everybody needs to read, Anna Karenina tonight. I mean that we need to really be mindful. Yeah, we need to really be mindful that the fact that we live in a surrounding made of 15 to 30 seconds video and short texts, and even texts that now are broken up in, snippets and short sentences, etc., because that's what the machine asks. That's what the algorithm asks us to do, is not healthy for our capacity to think and to understand the world. Third thing, very often stuff that is produced by AI is kind of recognizable. You go on a social media platform and you see a text that is signed by a person, but then you see how it is broken down and the kind of language it uses and so on. My take is, as soon as you recognize something is written by AI, just skip it and go and look at something else. And that's because it changes our way of framing things, and it changes our way of constructing language in our mind. You start having people that talk like chatbots because they only read stuff produced by chatbots and they only engage in conversations with chatbots. And that's not a healthy way of going forward. So those are just three of the things.
So we have less screen time. We have trying to prefer long form over short form whenever possible, and avoiding AI slop. I
Yeah.
think we're going to end on that. Bruno, thank you so much for speaking to me.
Thank you.